Thank you, Abby.
Okay, right, guys, thank you very much. The title of the talk is the belief in a creator God reasonable or laughable? And the subheading to that, does it matter? Quite often we find that people think that the idea of a creator God is a laughable idea and no reasonable person would seriously consider it. But hopefully today we're going to look at that. Now, many of you will know me, but if anyone doesn't, I want to give a brief introduction. So my name is Abby. I have a full-time job as a senior biomedical scientist in the biochemistry laboratory at Queen Alexandra Hospital in Portsmouth. I've been doing this job since I graduated from the University of Surrey with a degree in biomedical science 14 years ago. And more recently, I completed a master's degree also in biomedical science, theme developing here, specialising in clinical chemistry, and that was from the University of Ulster. So this picture was taken early on in the recent pandemic when we were issued with face visors, but before the wearing of face masks became compulsory. So that's what the lab looks like at the moment, although not for much longer. We're in the process of changing our analyzers, and the Beckman Olympus AU5800s are going to be replaced and make way for a new Roche kit, which is due to be installed at the end of August. So if you live in the Portsmouth area, and that includes Gosport, Fareham, Waterlooville, Emsworth, Havant, and pretty much everywhere in between, then any blood samples that you've had taken at your GP surgery will almost certainly have come here. We process around 3,500 samples every day, which includes all the work from the hospital, that's A&E, the wards, the clinics, GP surgeries, and various units such as the dialysis units and heart failure clinics around locally. So let me start by saying thank you for joining in on this Zoom session. I guess there'll be a variety of views represented, both here in the Zoom call and by those who might go on to watch the recording later on. Some of you might be convinced young Earth creationists, and if that's the case, I hope this presentation is an encouragement to you. Others might be more sceptical or even consider the idea to be anti-scientific or perhaps an embarrassment. And if you're in that group, then I hope you're feeling open-minded and by the end we'll at least recognise creationism as a valid and evidence-based viewpoint, even if it's one you don't share yourself. Now, normally it's best to start at the beginning, but since that's rather a contentious issue in this particular context, let's start with the subheading of the talk. Does it matter? Does it matter as a Christian whether you take Genesis 1 literally and believe God made the earth in 7 days, as is documented in the opening chapter of the Bible, or whether you take your lead from the scientific establishment and interpret Genesis as perhaps myth or maybe poetry? And I would argue it does matter, but I guess you were probably expecting that. After all, if it didn't matter, I probably wouldn't have wasted time putting this talk and presentation together. I think it matters for 3 reasons. Firstly, and most importantly, I think it matters for the gospel. The central message of the Christian faith is that Jesus died on the cross to take the punishment for our sin. Romans 6:23 tells us that death is a direct result of sin. And if all living things, including us, arrived here by the process of evolution, that is survival of the fittest, then there was plenty of death long before there was human sin. It doesn't take a Christian to see this contradiction. An atheist, Frank Zindler, said the following: the most devastating thing, though, that biology... Oh, hang on. Sorry, guys. The biology did to Christianity was the discovery of biological evolution. Now that we know that Adam and Eve were never real people, the central myth of Christianity is destroyed. If there never was an Adam and Eve, there never was an original sin. There never was an original sin, there is no need of salvation. If there's no need of salvation, there is no need of a saviour. And I submit that puts Jesus, historical or otherwise, into the ranks of the unemployed. And he finishes by saying, I think that evolution is absolutely the death knell of Christianity. So there's a real problem between the gospel of salvation that we preach and that Jesus taught us and evolution. Second reason, I would argue, is our identity. One unique aspect of Christianity is that we are made in the image of the living God. And it's this that gives us intrinsic value, regardless of how we measure up in others' eyes based on our looks, intelligence, or bank balance. We have worth because we are created in God's image. And this also leads us to hold certain views, seeking to protect the helpless and vulnerable, to act against injustice when we see it. But if we are just an accidental arrangement of atoms, then why does it matter if people are enslaved or abused or neglected? It's survival of the fittest after all. The final reason is the inerrancy of Scripture. That's a fancy way of saying that the Bible is reliable and accurate. After all, if we can't trust some of it, can we trust any of it? And even if we could ignore the first few chapters of the Bible, or perhaps write them off as illustrative rather than factual, the problem doesn't end there. In the book of Exodus, Moses cites creation as the reason for having a rest day in the week. Have you ever thought about that? A day is measured by the time it takes for the Earth to rotate once on its axis. The month is based on the orbit of the moon, and a year is the time taken for the Earth to orbit the sun. But there's actually no natural reason for a 7-day week other than the creation week recorded in the Bible. In Romans 5, the doctrine of justification is explained based on the sin of Adam compared with the righteousness of Christ. In 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about the resurrection, for as in Adam all die, so in Christ all will be made alive. Luke, in his Gospel, quotes the genealogy of Jesus, tracing him back to the son of Adam, the son of God, not the son of a less evolved pre-human. And even if you believe that all these biblical spirit-inspired authors to be wrong, would you say the same about the Son of God, the one who, according to the book of John, was there in the beginning? Jesus himself says in Mark 10, verse 6, "But at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female." Contrast this with the evolutionary viewpoint, which is helpfully demonstrated in what is known as a cosmic calendar, first imagined by an astronomer called Carl Sagan. So the idea is that the whole history of the universe can be condensed into one calendar year, with the point of the creation or the Big Bang on New Year's Day, and each day on the calendar equates to around 38 million years. I'll put up some dates here. So January the 1st is 13.8 billion years ago, allegedly, and the formation of the Earth on the 14th of September, around 4.5 billion years. According to this timeline, primitive humans don't show up until 10:30 on the 31st of December, and supposedly modern humans arrived at 23:52. So you're getting quite late on in the calendar. But obviously that is quite contrast to what Jesus says in the Bible. When he said that Adam and Eve were made at the beginning of creation, either Jesus is mistaken, which is a big problem, or Jesus is lying, which is an even bigger problem. I do want to make clear at this point that I'm not saying you have to believe in a young earth creationism to be a Christian. The Bible is really clear. In Romans 10, verse 9, it says, "And if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord, and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved." Nowhere in the Bible does it say, to my knowledge, if you take a literal view of Genesis, you will be saved. However, if you want to combine evolution with Christianity, I would argue that you will have to accept a number of theological contradictions about God and what he says about himself in his word. And perhaps I would also argue you would struggle to hold a solid, coherent and consistent understanding of the Bible. So we've looked at why it matters from a biblical perspective, but let's get to the crux of the issue. Is it intellectually reasonable in the modern scientific age to hold a young earth creationist view? And to begin to answer that, it's important to understand there are different types of science. There's observational science, which you can do in a laboratory. You can record your method and your results. You can give that methodology to someone else who can repeat the experiment and reasonably expect to get the same results. And that's the basis for the science that I do at work. I know that if I add sodium hydroxide and picric acid to a serum sample in the right quantities, it will form a dark yellow complex with one of the molecules in that serum. and this complex will absorb light at a wavelength that can be measured compared to a calibration curve, and that will allow me to estimate the concentration of creatinine in the patient's blood, which in turn for the clinician will give them an indication of how well or not so well their kidneys are working. The other type of science is historical science, and it's harder to test and usually impossible to repeat. It's looking at things that happened many years in the past and trying to make sense of them by applying things we know now. You might be thinking, well, science is science. How can people disagree with the evidence? The issue with the debate on origins is rarely to do with the actual evidence and much more often to do with the interpretation of the evidence. So although the media would have you believe otherwise, all scientists are fallible humans, just like you and I. And when they approach their work, they come with the baggage of their upbringing, the culture, and personal views. No one on either side of the debate is truly objective. And I think it's easy to dismiss scientists who take a literal view of Genesis by saying, well, your religious book says that God made the world, so you twist the evidence to support your view. But there is just as much bias on the evolutionary side of the debate. When scientists interpret the evidence, it's through the lens of their own worldview. Evolutionist scientists like to appear objective and purely evidence-driven, but on occasions they can give themselves away. Professor Lewontin, who was an evolutionary geneticist, said this: "Our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism." And there's a definition of materialism there, that only physical matter is all that exists. There's no nothing more, nothing supernatural, i.e. no God. In fact, a lot of avid proponents of evolution are also secular humanists. People like Brian Cox and Alice Roberts write books on evolution, but have also spoken and support and acted as presidents even of the Humanist Society. That is, they combine a humanist ethic with the doctrine that God does not exist. So from a worldview perspective, they've got as much a vested interest in proving God does not exist as Christians do in proving God does exist. It's perhaps a peculiarity of humans that we start with what we believe and then seek out evidence to support that. So at this point, I would like to set out the two conflicting viewpoints. It's always helpful if you're disagreeing with someone to have a grasp of what they believe and the evidence that they base that belief on. I've already alluded to the young Earth creationist view, which takes Genesis literally, and that is there was nothing except God, and in 6 days he created the earth, the sky, the sea, and everything that is in them. If you read Genesis, those are the verses for everything that was created and at what point. And of course, God resting on the seventh day. The biblical timeline doesn't require or even allow for millions or billions of years, and the earth can be dated from the Bible to between 6,000 and 10,000 years old. There was one bishop in the 1600s who famously postulated the date of creation as exactly noon on the 23rd of October 4004 BC. Now, I don't think the Bible was written with the intention of giving us an exact date, but I do think it gives us enough information to date the age of the earth in terms of thousands of years rather than billions. So how do secular scientists who discount the idea of God explain how we got there? The idea is there was nothing except a singularity of unimaginable pressure and temperature which exploded 13.8 billion years ago. And suddenly everything around us, everything that exists, all suddenly came into being. All matter and all energy was formed in the moment of the Big Bang. I heard recently that it was suggested that the time it took for the Big Bang to happen was a quintillionth of a femtosecond. So I wouldn't even like to imagine how quick that was. But this produced atoms and fragments of atoms, which over time under gravity clumped together to form stars and galaxies and planets. 4.5 billion years ago, this process caused the formation of the Earth. The oceans appeared when the temperature dropped low enough for water to condense, and then life appeared around about the same time. The dinosaurs were around between 245 and 66 million years ago, and then the humans finally turned up around 2 million years ago. So I think it'd be helpful to take these one step at a time. The Big Bang, the supposed beginning of the universe, is not as universally accepted as the media would have you believe. Like all studies on the origin of the universe, we're hampered by the fact that it wasn't witnessed, measured, or recorded at the time. So it relies on finding evidence and using what we know about the laws of physics to interpret it. There was an open letter to the New Scientist written by 33 top scientists, not creationists, but scientists in the sort of astronomy fields. And I've got their quotes here. Unfortunately, I've got a line down the side of my screen, so can I have a volunteer to read that?
I can do it.
Thank you.
The Big Bang today relies on a growing number of hypothetical entities, things that we have never observed. Inflation, dark matter, and dark energy are the most prominent examples. Without them, there will be a fatal contradiction between the observations made by the astronomers and the predictions of the Big Bang theory.
Thank you very much. So a good theory should be backed up by the observable evidence, but the Big Bang is not. Now, to be clear, these scientists are not suggesting that the Big Bang be thrown out in favour of creation. They're simply flagging up the fact that the Big Bang is a really poor theory and lacking in evidence and based on a lot of things that have not been observed. One of the problems with the Big Bang is called the horizon problem. And it basically is where the same amount of microwave cosmic radiation is detected coming from everywhere we look. So we can look all around in every direction and we see the same amount of this microwave cosmic radiation. But the Big Bang model predicts there should be patches of different temperatures across the universe. But this is not the case. It's very homologous. There are other observations, including the abundance of elements such as helium and lithium, data from redshift theory, and also the distribution of galaxies, which all call into question the legitimacy of the Big Bang as a theory. The authors go on to say something else, which I can only see half of, so can I have another volunteer to read this one, please?
The Big Bang theory can boast of no quantitative predictions that have subsequently been validated by observation.
Brilliant, thank you. And that is the key to a good theory. The whole point of coming up with a theory is you say what you think happened, then you say what you would expect to see if you're correct, and then you go and look for it. And with the Big Bang, they just don't find it. They come up with what they think's happened. They say, well, if we're correct, these things should be observable. But when they go and look for it, they don't see it. You might be thinking, if it's such a poor theory, why hasn't it been done away with? And I would say that so much of their worldview has been built on this, they really can't afford for it to fail. The proponents would say that just like any theory, as you make new discoveries, they can adjust their model. The trouble is the parameters are so fluid that they can be adjusted to suit just about anything, particularly if you introduce lots of these non-observable fudge factors. Michelle, you're up.
Giving support only to projects within the Big Bang framework undermines a fundamental element of the scientific method, the constant testing of the theory against observation. Such a restriction makes unbased discussion and research impossible.
Fab, thank you. So this is really the reason these authors are writing. It's an issue of funding, because a lot of funding goes to people who are supporting the Big Bang theory, which means that there is no funding going into any other research. And they finish up by saying, in no other field of physics would this fudging be accepted as a way of bridging the gap between theory and observation. It would at the least raise serious questions about the validity of the underlying theory. So hopefully I've given you enough food for thought to maybe question that the Big Bang is not as robust and scientifically proven as perhaps we're given to believe. So having looked at how the appearance of the universe is on rather sandy foundations, let's fast forward to the formation of the Earth, which supposedly happened 4.5 billion years ago. Now, this date is achieved by using something called radiometric dating. So let's see how radiometric dating works. It's based on the measurement of types of atoms known as isotopes. And the first isotope is an unstable one, such as the uranium-238, and you've got on the left-hand side here the potassium-40, samarium-147. These are all unstable isotopes, which over time decay. And they decay to a more stable daughter isotope. In the case of uranium-238, it turns into lead-206. And it's possible to measure how fast this actually happens, the rate at which the decay occurs. And the speed it happens is measured in units called a half-life. I've got a really basic diagram to explain how that works. So if you imagine this is your rock, and all those sort of grey circles are your rock particles. As you can see, as it was formed up, it incorporated some very small little red dots, and these are your unstable parent isotopes. And over time, they will turn into the more stable daughter isotopes. And obviously, like I say, it's very simplified. I've only got a handful there of the isotopes, but the time it takes for half of them to decay is your half-life. It will then take another half-life for half of the remaining parent radioisotopes to become daughter isotopes. So in the case of uranium-238, the half-life is 4.5 billion years. For potassium-40, it's 1.2 billion years. One type of radiometric dating you might have heard of is carbon dating. And the half-life of carbon-14 is only 5,700 years. So compared to some of these others, it's much more quick. Now, the difficulties with radiometric dating come from the assumptions that need to be made. Because firstly, it's not actually known what the ratio of parent to daughter isotopes was in the newly formed rock. We can't really assume that it was all uranium-238. There may have been some lead-206 there at the beginning as well. Secondly, it's assumed there was no contamination of the samples. But actually, as the lava moves up through the Earth's crust, isotopes from the inner walls of volcanoes can mix with the lava and contaminate it. And also isotopes that are carried in groundwater can affect the formed rock and infiltrate it. Finally, there's also some evidence that actually the rate of decay may not have been constant over time. That gets a bit more complicated. If you're interested in finding out about that, I can send you some information. So what do the results look like? Mount St. Helens erupted in 1986, and that's probably within living memory for most of us. In 1996, some of the lava that had been observed to come from that volcano was tested using potassium-argon radiometric dating. The 10-year-old rock was dated at around 350,000 years old. Similarly, in the Grand Canyon, some basalt rocks were measured. Some were from a more recent volcanic eruption, and some were from the very base of the Grand Canyon, supposedly much, much older. Using rubidium-strontium dating, both rocks, the older one and the younger one, gave results of 1.1 billion years. But it gets worse. They then tested the basalt rocks from the recent volcanic event, and the uranium-lead dating gave 2.6 billion years. And they tried again with Sumerian neodymium radiometric dating, and that gave 916 million years. So it really does call into question just how reliable these methods are if when they're tested on rocks where we know the age, they do not give valid results, and even the different methods give conflicting results. The good news is that radiometric dating actually gives good evidence to support the idea that the world is only thousands of years old. I mentioned carbon dating briefly. Now, unlike some of the other forms of radiometric dating, the half-life of carbon-14 is only 5,700 years. Diamonds are the hardest substance known to man, And because of this, they are much more resistant to contamination from the environment. Naturally occurring diamonds are claimed to be millions of years old. And if this were true, then all of the carbon-14 would have decayed to nitrogen a very long time ago. However, when 12 diamond samples were analysed, they all contained detectable levels of carbon-14. In fact, fossils and coal found in all levels of rock that were analysed contained carbon-14, which just shouldn't be present if the world is only millions of years old. I would suggest that because it was present, it gives evidence to the fact that the world is thousands and not millions of years old. Okay. Moving on to the oceans, I have to confess that I struggled to find the basis for the age of the oceans. It might possibly be based on the dating of rocks with traces of microbes on the ocean floor, but we've already covered the issues with radiometric dating. It could possibly also be linked to the time that they believed the Earth was cool enough for water to exist as liquid rather than a gas. So I'm going to look at some of the observations that we can make about the oceans today. Now, oceans are continually being fed by rivers, which wash minerals and mud into them from the land. It is estimated that around 20 billion tonnes of mud enters the oceans by river and coastal erosion every year. Now, most of this will sit on the ocean floor, although a small amount, around about 1 billion tonnes, moves under the Earth's crust with tectonic plate movements. But if the oceans are really 3.8 billion years old, even using conservative estimates, the depth of mud on the ocean floor should be around 20 kilometres, that's 12.5 miles deep. But we can measure it, and the observational results reveal there is only 400 metres of mud, that's 440 yards, covering the whole of the ocean floor. There's a similar problem with the salinity of the oceans, that's the salt level, because it's possible to estimate how much salt is entering and leaving the sea. Like mud, it enters by weathering and erosion of salt deposits on land, and also through hot springs on the floor of the ocean. It doesn't leave the ocean very easily, so the amount of salt in the sea is slowly increasing. Calculations show that even assuming the ocean started off as freshwater, the sea is not salty enough to be billions of years old. And the same is true of nickel. The rate it enters from the land and leaves the ocean in manganese nodules can actually be calculated. And if the oceans were anywhere near the evolutionary age, the levels of nickel would be too toxic to sustain marine life. Okay, right, first life. So once the universe has appeared and the Earth and oceans have formed, then the first life is supposed to have evolved. And you might be surprised to learn this is going to be the shortest section because there's actually nothing to refute. It's quite a poorly publicised fact that no one knows how life first began without the input of a creator. Because the reality is that no matter how much time you give it, neither rock, clay or crystal can give rise to anything like the biochemical molecules required to breathe, move, feed, and perhaps most crucially, reproduce. I was amazed actually when I first discovered this whilst I was studying a module on genetics at university. At the time, there was a $1 million prize available for anyone who could suggest a robust theory about how the first life evolved. But eventually this prize was withdrawn because no one came close to an answer. One problem is that even the most simple, in inverted commas, life forms are actually hugely complex at the molecular level. Back when Darwin came up with his theory, he could look at a tiny cell and think, well, it's a blob, isn't it? Yeah, it could just appear. But as science has advanced and our knowledge has increased, we can see how incredibly complex they are. Even the simplest organism that we know of, which is a single-celled Mycoplasma bacteria, has 525 genes made up of 580,000 base pairs, which all code for a variety of proteins required for life. Interestingly, given the hopelessness of the origin of life problem, it's actually become increasingly popular to propose that life, or the building blocks thereof, arrived from outer space on asteroids or meteorites. But of course, this doesn't actually solve the problem, it just moves it somewhere else. Okay, dinosaurs. So both dinosaur and human dating is based heavily on fossil evidence. So I thought we'd take a look at how fossils are formed and why perhaps they give evidence for creation and rather than evolution. So, how does a fossil form? Firstly, you need an animal that is rapidly buried, sometimes in sand, but usually in mud. And in many cases, the animal appears to have been buried alive. If you look at some of these pictures here, this fish was midway through its lunch when sadly he was encased in mud. Even more sadly, perhaps, this dinosaur was in the middle of giving birth. You can just see the baby ichthyosaur emerging from the birth canal as they both succumbed to the, well, presumably some sort of mudslide that covered it. It's really important that they are buried immediately. If you think about it, if you see a dead animal on the side of the road, you don't think, oh, that'll be fossilized in a few thousand years, because something's going to come along and eat it. Burying is essential to prevent scavenging by other animals, and it protects the remains from weathering. Over time, water infused with minerals seeps into the remains and replaces some or all of the bone or fills in the spaces to give a rock-like substance. And fossilization is actually quite rare because it requires very quick and complete burial. It also requires favourable conditions in the form of temperature, pressure, acidity, and also a mineral-rich environment. It's interesting to note that these conditions are likely to be prevalent during and after the flood. The Bible tells us that all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and that would have been producing lots of minerals and heat. And the flood itself would have caused a lot of animals to be killed and buried very quickly. But how long does it take to create a fossil? Some Japanese scientists asked the same question back in 2004, and they tested it. They found an area that was suitable for fossilization, and they took some wood and they set up an experiment in natural conditions. So it wasn't in the laboratory, it was actually out in the environment. And in just 7 years, they managed to fossilize their piece of wood. Actually, more close to home, this is in Yorkshire. And I took this from their tourist information website. So I get someone to read that, because again, I can only see half of my words.
Yeah, I'm back, sorry. The Petrifying Well is England's oldest visitor attraction. It was first recorded by the King's Antiquary in 1538 and has been visited by millions of people since 1630. It is here that you can watch everyday objects turn into stone, compared with stalactite, or I can't say them words.
Just skip them.
Or stalagmite. The items petrify very quickly. A small teddy bear takes around 3 to 5 months. You can take a stone teddy bear home with you. They are available to buy in the gift shop.
Thanks. Sorry, I stitched you up with that one a bit, didn't I? Yes, so I mean, obviously a teddy bear is very porous and will very quickly absorb the minerals, unlike an animal's bones. But you can see that we shouldn't be fooled into looking at a fossil and assuming just because something's fossilized, it's therefore millions or billions of years old. It's actually worth noting too that given the huge number of fossils found, those transitional fossils predicted by Darwin have been in really short supply, and the handful that have been found are really quite contentious. Okay, so not only do fossils not prove evolution, they can actually give support to the creationist model. Back in 2001, a huge Tyrannosaurus rex thigh bone was excavated out in the desert in Montana, but it had to be transported from this dig site to a laboratory to be studied. But because it was so big, it was too heavy for the helicopter to lift. So the decision was made to break the bone in two, and this produced some little bone fragments that were studied by an evolutionary scientist called Dr. Mary Schweitzer. Now, she dissolved away the hard fossilized parts of the bone in acid, and that actually left some small amounts of soft tissue that she wasn't expecting to find. This soft tissue contained red blood cells, the protein collagen, and also DNA. This is a massive problem to evolutionary scientists, because once something dies, the DNA initially remains intact. It's really useful for solving crimes and identifying corpses, that sort of thing. But it does break down over time, especially when exposed to the natural environment. Now, tests have been carried out, even before this discovery, on the breakdown rate of DNA in various conditions, and calculations were made to determine how much time would pass before DNA became impossible to detect. The temperature determines how quickly DNA breaks down, but studies have shown that even at quite cool temperatures, the DNA would not survive more than 800,000 years, and it's more likely that after just 2,500 years at the temperatures of around 20 degrees, the DNA sequences would be so broken down they could not be detected. In fact, Mary Schweitzer herself said, extrapolations predict that all organics are going to be gone completely in 100,000 years, and that includes not just the DNA, but also the blood cells and the collagen protein. So the problem is dinosaurs were supposed to have become extinct 66 million years ago, which is enough time for all the organic material to have broken down 650 times over. And this goes back to what I was saying at the beginning about scientists having world views. There are two ways of viewing this evidence. If the underlying assumption, the world view, is that the dinosaurs died out 66 million years ago, then they have to explain how the DNA was preserved. To begin with, it was suggested the DNA must belong to bacteria that had infected the bone in recent years, but the DNA was tested and found to contain a type of histone protein that is only found in vertebrates, i.e. animals with a backbone, so never in bacteria. The current view is to marvel how, against the odds, the DNA managed to survive for such a long time. If, however, your underlying assumption is that God made dinosaurs along with the other land animals on day 5, there's no need to explain away the evidence because it fits with the biblical timeline. So I want to finish briefly by looking at human evolution and some of the logical outworking of holding to this view. You're probably familiar with the March of Progress diagram, although you've probably come across it in one of its more simplified variations like this, or perhaps even one of the more amusing spin-offs, often depicted on posters or t-shirts. So although the graphic itself has been viewed by billions of people across the world, what is less familiar is the evidence behind it. Several of these creatures on the supposed evolution from ape to man are now acknowledged within the scientific community as extinct apes, or having nothing to do with the alleged human evolution. However, this diagram still makes appearances in school classrooms and textbooks because its simplicity makes it excellent propaganda material. The original author admitted that quite a few of the first 4 or 5 in this sequence were actually quadrupeds, which means they walked on all hands and feet, knuckle walking. They didn't actually stand up. So the idea of them being drawn, not just being able to balance on their hind legs, but also being able to walk quite competently is actually quite misleading. But there are darker connotations to holding to the theory of evolution. It's not often talked about, but in the early 20th century, the theory of human evolution was used as justification for some of the worst atrocities carried out by mankind. The massacres of several African tribes inhabiting modern-day Botswana and Namibia were justified by this belief. So this one for you, Michelle.
Their fate was governed by the same laws of natural selection. Surely their disappearance was a result of their inability to adapt to the arrival of a stronger, more capable races and the civilizations they brought with them. De Keyser's Holocaust.
That's the book it was written in, thank you. And later this same belief was used as justification for the attempted eradication of the Jews.
Darwin's On the Original of Species, with its brutally materialist account of nature as bleak survivalism, was made to serve as justification for the extermination of Namibian tribes and later for Hitler's biological anti-Semitism. That was by Ian Thompson.
Thank you. Okay, so I hope you found this presentation interesting. I'm just about within time. It's not quite 11 o'clock, is it?
Well done.
Yeah, that's good.
If I come out of screen sharing, I can hopefully see. No questions. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, Abby, I have a question.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you. There's so much work in there. Was that part of your research project for one of your dissertations or something? It looks like it is, but I don't know.
No, I'm just an enthusiastic amateur. I find the whole creation thing very interesting, partly because it's so hard sometimes to find information on it. because often the media and education will come very heavily on the evolution side of things and skim over anything that supports creation. So yeah, it's just an interest of mine, a hobby, if you like.
My second question, if I may, is are you happy for me to share that, your presentation with family and friends? Because I just think it's worth sharing.
Yeah, if you want to, you can.
Thank you.
Michelle, do you have a question?
Yeah, well, it's about, it's right at the beginning, really. I don't know if I'm going to be able to ask this question. I might be on the wrong track, but you said about, like the beginning of creation, it's the beginning when God created the beginning of creation. And, you read that verse from Matthew saying, and you said, either Jesus is lying, which we know that he's not. But so when God created humans, which was 2 million years ago, so was there other humans around beforehand, or were we like the chosen ones?
So there are various attempts to combine evolution with Christianity. I would say that it doesn't work and it's not necessary. So you can either take evolution, whereby humans evolved 2 million years ago as part of an evolutionary process, or you can take the biblical account, which tells you that humans were made on day 6, along with the other animals, right at the beginning of creation. Now, some people try to sort of merge the two together and try to take the evolutionary science and fit the Christian account around it, but it doesn't tend to work very well, and often for reasons like you said, as Jesus said, that Adam and Eve were at the beginning of creation. They were made right at the beginning because God made the earth around 6,000 years ago in 7 days, as he said. It doesn't fit with adding in millions and billions of years. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So I mean, I'm happy with it all, and I don't even like, you mentioned about, how old is a piece of rock when you was using that as an example. I'm not really that worried how old a piece of rock is, really, because I believe God is our creator and that he created everything. But it's just interesting to now you've sort of explained that very well, Maya. I add, it's very intellectual. I mean, some of it, did go a bit over my head, but yeah. So it just makes me think that was there other type of humans around that weren't from God? Maybe they were evil, or something like that. It's just, I don't know. It's just sort of like made me think. But I mean, I know we're the chosen ones. Like we are, God made creation, like humans, on day 6. But they were for him, we were made in his image. Maybe the other ones, what I'm saying, is not made in his image.
I don't think there were any other humans before Adam and Eve. I don't think there were any other creatures before, or anything before.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to get
day
at.
one. Yeah.
Okay, cool. That answers my question. I did have another one, if I'm allowed to ask another one.
Yeah, go on.
So also, I get a lot of from family members. Certain family members believe in the flat earth. Now I don't. So is there any way that you could, give me a few tips on how I can answer certain people on the flat earth theory?
It's so hard, isn't it? Because it's just so ridiculous. You sort of wonder how anyone could hold to that. And I must confess, it makes me really cross when I've been to sort of creationist events and the guys at the front are really intelligent people, professors giving really good evidence for creation, and someone in the audience stands up and goes, "Well, I think the earth is flat." And you think, Oh, for goodness sake, it's quite embarrassing, really. The earth is not flat. It's never been flat, and no one's ever thought the earth was flat. I do think that actually this has been encouraged by people trying to discredit creationists as being stupid. If you look back to history, it was actually invented afterwards that Christopher Columbus thought he'd fall off the edge of the world. He never thought that. I think have you ever seen the Queen has the orb and the scepter, which are hundreds of years old. And the orb is based on the shape of the earth. It's not a recent thing. We've suddenly discovered the earth is round. People have known for hundreds of years the earth is round. It's hard to argue it. If you can try and find out what their evidence is for it, you can
Yeah.
try and argue it.
That's a good one. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
why do you think the Earth is flat?
Yeah, I mean, I was at a family thing on Saturday, and it came up, and I didn't actually get involved. I thought I can't be bothered because I just, you know, like you say, it's a silly conversation really, and it probably is just to cause an argument and to discredit the Bible really. So
Yeah, I mean, some people use the argument. I think in one of the Psalms talks about the it talks about the circle of the earth in the Psalms, which kind of is like, well, the circle goes round. There's another one where people say, oh, well, you know, the idea that the sun goes round the earth is from the Bible, because it says the sun rises in one side and then moves across and sets the other side. But even that isn't proof that the Bible or the person who wrote it ever thought that. Because we talk about the sun rising and the sun setting, we know it's not actually the sun moving, it's us moving. It's just the way, from our perspective, and the way we talk about it. Does that make sense?
yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Yeah, it's hard to argue things, but if you ever do come across someone who's arguing something that you disagree with, try and find out what evidence they've based it on, and then try and discredit the evidence rather than, because just saying the earth is flat, and you can say anything, can't you? And it's hard to disagree with it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Abby, when you talked about things like the amount of salt in the sea and everything, I mean, I found that really convincing, but then I want to be convinced, don't I? But I mean, would scientists generally acknowledge that? Because it just sounds like a complete hoax if they're actually acknowledging these problems and yet not speaking them out.
Yeah, I think it's difficult because I think things that disagree with their theory tend to get buried a bit, as it were. I think the biggest problem is that science is such a wide and vast field. There's microbiologists looking at things that are so tiny you can't see with your eye. There's astronomy guys looking at out the stars in the sky. There's biologists, there's chemists, there's physicists, there's everything. Geologists as well. And something that I've become more aware of is that scientists assume that just because their particular field doesn't prove evolution, they assume that another field does. Yeah. And I've mentioned this before. I had this conversation with a university lecturer who'd actually written a book called Genetic Evolution or something like that. And we were looking in the module at how the origins of life came about and how no one really knows. And in the end, I said, well, I think that, God made the earth in 6 days and all the rest of it. And he sort of scoffed that. But rather than saying, well, here's my expertise on the subject, he said, well, what about the geological evidence? I'm thinking, well, neither of us know anything about geology, so why are you citing that? And I suspect the geologists would say, well, yes, well, our evidence says this, and this could be interpreted as this. But the astrophysicists, they've nailed the Big Bang, and so they know how old the Earth is. And I think because no one can be an expert in every field, they kind of assume that their area can be, areas that can support their theory, but also some areas don't. But it's okay because someone else has got it covered. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, actually.
See, Abby, I can just join in. Thank you for tolerating me just sitting in on this. But I have a comment on the Big Bang Theory.
Okay.
What I find most interesting is this Big Bang Theory put into place the universe. And as far as this Earth is concerned, it put into place this globe on its axis on which the Earth rotated, which gives us our seasons of seed time and harvest, gives us the seasons, spring, summer, autumn, winter. And when you look at the whole of the universe, it's just an amazing thing. My question really is, the Big Bang, every other Big Bang that I'm aware of has been totally destructive.
Yeah.
And with that, I'm going to finish.
Yeah, it is. And when it was first come up with, people were quite obsessed about it because before the idea of the Big Bang, that it was assumed that the universe had always existed and always would exist. And some people are like, oh, well, the Big Bang sounds a little bit too much like creation. But it does show in a sense that there was a beginning. albeit they would have it billions of years ago rather than immediately. And you're right, explosions don't cause. And it's not just the matter and the energy. It's all the laws of physics that govern everything that's going around, around us. Gravity and everything else, and thermodynamics and all the other rules that mean that our world works. You can't explain those being created or occurring because of an explosion.
Absolutely.
Sorry, someone else have a question as well.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, Abby, actually. The evolutionist, the Big Bang, it destroys things. It doesn't create anything. I don't understand their viewpoint on that, actually, but they do stick to it, don't they? And I mean, if we have a Big Bang on the earth, it destroys things. How can that then create things? But they do stick to that theory, don't they? I don't understand it at all.
No, and there's so many issues with it. I mean, where did it come from in the first place as well? I mean, we can have gods because God did not have a beginning, therefore he doesn't need a cause. But the universe had a beginning, therefore it requires a cause. And there is no cause.
No, not at all.
Zoe has... Sorry, go on.
Sorry, can I just ask a question, Abby?
You can, Joyce.
In the beginning of the Bible, so many people lived for hundreds of years. Methuselah was the oldest man who ever lived. Where did it start that they now only live at, like we say, 70 years and 10? Is that in scripture?
I think it is, yes. It does record the ages.
Sorry?
It does record the ages. So I think it was around about the flood when God said, man's years will be 120 and no more. I think it's important to realise that right at the beginning, God made Adam and Eve to be perfect. They didn't have any mutations built up inside them. So when they recreated, there was that their genome was pretty perfect. Whereas over the years, there's something called genetic entropy. The evolutionists like the idea that actually we're all evolving and becoming more advanced. But the reality is that the genome is becoming less advanced. Mutations are accumulating, and it's we're devolving, if you like, rather than evolving. But yeah, right at the beginning, and that's obviously people say, well, who did Adam and Eve's children marry? Well, each other. It wouldn't have been a problem because there wouldn't have been any genetic traits that they couldn't risk passing on to their children. And it wasn't morally objectionable until I think the law of Moses said you can't marry your sister or your parents or whatever else.
How long do you think Adam and Eve lived in the garden in perfect harmony with God?
That's a good question. It doesn't tell us. I think there are two things that you can give you an idea. I think it wasn't very long, unfortunately. And the reason I think that is because the Bible tells us that all humans are born in sin. And God's command to Adam and Eve was to procreate. So presumably they would have cracked on with some procreation fairly early on. And if all humans, including Seth, the first child, as it were born in sin, it's a guess, an educated guess, but yeah, we don't know how long they were in the garden for, but if they did obey God fairly early on, which you'd assume they would, and all humans were born in sin, then probably they didn't last a great deal of time, sadly.
Well, they did have a lot of work to do, didn't they? They named all the animals and they named all the trees and all the rest of it. They had quite a lot of work to do in the garden, didn't they?
Yes, you're right. They definitely had a lot of work to do, so perhaps the procreation had to wait a bit.
More work to do.
But you see, I don't believe that they had sex then.
It would have been very hard to...
They didn't realise that they were naked until sin came into the world and the devil tempted them.
Yes,
Up until then, they were quite happy, weren't they?
Yes, but sex isn't sinful, Joyce.
Oh.
It's a gift of God.
Yeah.
I imagine they were quite happy, quite happily at it.
Yeah.
Oh.
And he did tell them to be fruitful as well, didn't he?
Precisely.
Yeah.
And being sinless and obedient, I'm sure they cracked on with being fruitful.
Yeah.
They would have created the perfect race, wouldn't they, if they hadn't been sinful?
Well, yes. But then, ifs and buts.
Yeah.
Someone has asked, would you say that evolutionists fit evidence discovered into their worldview and therefore dismiss any other idea? That's an interesting point. I think it is true. One thing that you often see in headlines, Earth older than first thought, or plants evolved earlier than first thought. It's important to realise that with billions and millions of years, the parameters are so flexible that really, whatever you discover, you can just sort of adjust your parameters accordingly. It's quite easy to fudge it a bit. But I don't want to do a disservice to evolutionary science. I don't think they're deliberately deceitful. I think they honestly believe that the Big Bang and evolution are fixed, and therefore everything else needs to be interpreted in light of that. I don't think they're deliberately going out to deceive, because their hearts are so hardened against God and creationism that they will explain evidence in favour of that away, because it's just not possible in their minds.
Abby, what about scientists who are Christians? Do you know where they would stand on the creationist view? I guess they that might all be different, but in general, do you have any information?
There are quite a few creation scientists who hold very high posts in academia. I've written a lot of papers. One particular I think of is Professor Stuart Burgess, who's a lecturer in design. He's written some wonderful books and done some amazing things. So he's written amazing books about how design is fitted into creation, and how certain aspects of design could not have evolved. But he's also done work on space satellites. He was involved in designing the mechanism for the bikes chains and transmission at the last Olympics and also this Olympics, and we actually did very well in our cycling at the Olympics, so also did a good job there. And there are others. There's a video, I might try and dig it out and I'll send you the link, where I think it's 10 or 12 PhD scientists, all in different fields of science, all put forward how their field supports creationism. So yeah, there are scientists. Some will stay quiet because if you talk out as a creationist, you risk losing your funding and being sort of sidelined, not having your papers published. But there are some who are bold enough to speak out.
Thank you.
Someone's asked, how do they work out the measurement of isotopes? And I confess I don't actually know what method they use for measuring isotopes. I don't have any reason to believe it's questionable. Obviously, with the carbon-14, they had to be very careful because they didn't want to introduce contamination whilst they were doing. So you have to have a very clean lab and very special conditions if you're doing this sort of measuring, because you don't want to introduce either parent or daughter isotopes into your sample whilst you're doing the procedure. But if you're interested, I can look into how they measure it. Any more?
Abby, can I ask you something?
You can, Joy.
Thank you very much for this morning. Really appreciate it. Could you tell me whether this is right, that each branch of science is known as an ology? Yes, and does that biology and all the rest of them, and that comes from the word logos, which means the reason why. And then you link that with Jesus, who is the word, the logos. And he is the reason why everything exists. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So ology, I think, is, like you say, reasoning, and I think also knowledge is often translated as. But yeah, it's just the way, just the nomenclature for science, different fields of science, isn't it?
Yeah. So I thought that was really quite wonderful.
I sometimes think that evolution is a bit like the emperor's new clothes. A lot of scientists can see that it's standing there naked, but no one wants to stand up and say it for fear of being shouted down as stupid. It does take quite a lot of bravery to put your head above the parapet, and I do hold people like Professor Stuart Burgess in a great deal of really respect him for standing up. It's not easy. It's not easy in academia, particularly. But you know, if evolution's naked, let's say it.
It's a lot easier to believe in the Bible and God's word.
I agree, actually, Joyce. I sort of look out in the garden and see all the amazing things, and you see newborn kittens and newborn babies and lots of incredible things, you know, things in nature, and you think, really, this has just happened by mistake? Yeah, but you know, having a feeling isn't the same as scientific proof, is it? So it helps to have both.
Do you find it tricky with your children, Abby, you know, kind of guiding them as to how to cope in school and when to be quiet and when not?
It is difficult in lots of areas, not just science, but I would encourage them to look at the evidence, because it's so easy for someone to say, oh, this happened, and then go, oh, the Bible must be wrong then. But okay, what happened? How do you know it happened? What's the evidence for it? And you need to, like I said at the beginning, you need to understand the arguments or the evidence to the other side of the argument before you can argue it. You can't just say, oh, you know, the Bible says this. Well, you can say the Bible says this, therefore I believe it, and that's perfectly valid if you want to do that. But if you want to argue it from a scientific point of view, you need to know why they're saying these things. I used to find that growing up, you'd see something in the newspaper like new species of human found. You go, oh dear, maybe it has cast doubt on the Bible. But I remember doing a talk to Tribe a little while ago, and actually about 2 weeks before I did the talk, this happened. A new species of human was found. I thought, I better look into that. When I looked into it, they'd found a handful of bones from about five different individuals, which had all washed into a cave over the period of about 2,000 years. And most of the pieces of bone were teeth anyway. It was hard to say, really, you're basing an entire new species of human on this paltry evidence. So I would encourage people to look at the evidence, and it's hard sometimes because you sort of get a bit daunted and think, oh, the scientists know best. But actually, it's not hard to look at it and just be a bit critical. Try not to read and go, oh, that must be true because it's been reported in the Telegraph or whatever. Think, hang on, what's the evidence? Is that really convincing enough to say this, that, and the other? Because they'll put in there what the most convincing evidence is. They're not going to sort of hold back on the really good bits, are they? And if you read that and think, really, that doesn't seem very convincing to me, and you can often have links to the journals where it came from, and you can read that. And again, quite often something will be published and it will make the headlines, and then a few weeks later other scientists will come along and say, well, hang on, I don't think that's right, and they'll pick holes in it. But that doesn't get published, that doesn't make the headlines. So it's worth looking a bit deeper into the evidence. Any more for any more?
Yeah, I was going to say, have we exhausted questions? Shall I stop the recording? Shall I stop that? Yeah.